In the 11th and 12th century, Bibles were large multi-volume books owned almost exclusively by religious institutions, churches, cathedrals, monasteries. In the 13th century, by contrast, they became much smaller volumes. From the end of the 12th century, their dimensions began to shrink, and they were increasingly produced in one volume. This is a lovely example of a Bible produced in Paris towards the middle of the 13th century. Many 13th century Bibles were significantly smaller than this one, but it still counts as an easily portable book. In terms of content, the Bible is now arranged in the chapters that we would recognise today, an innovation of the early 13th century. It has a set series of prefaces. Many, but not all of the books, have a text introducing them. And it also has, at the end, an index or an explanation in alphabetical order of the Hebrew names in the Bible. In terms of presentation, it's again fairly standard. 2 columns per page, written in a precise but very small script, known as Pearl script, divisions clearly indicated by initials of different sizes. The prefaces to biblical books have decorated initials, and the introductions, the first letter of each biblical book itself, is historiated, i.e. it has an image within that initial relating to the subject or to the author of the biblical book itself. Then alternately red and blue initials, flourished in the other colour, mark the beginning of the chapters. All very clear. And in fact, it's this layout, 2 columns, very fine parchment, dense black text on the page, that still determines the appearance of a fine Bible, a printed one, today. Well, as a class, many of them were produced and large numbers still survive. A rough estimate of the number of 13th century manuscript Bibles produced would be a figure over 10,000, perhaps 13,000, 14,000. That's based on the number of them that appear in inventories from the period and the number that survives. We have something like 2,000 surviving copies. So to produce them was a major work and required a lot of parchment. Typically, to produce a Bible like this scale, this size, you would need something in the region of 50 to 60 animal skins. So if we're then thinking about that multiplied by perhaps 13,000 copies, that's 400,000 to 500,000 animals during the course of the 13th century whose skins are needed to make the books that are being produced. The peak of production was the middle of the 13th century, and it then gradually declined towards the end of the 13th century. 1-volume Bibles, roughly in this format, were produced in Italy and in England, but above all, they were made in France, and there, principally in Paris. And this was certainly made in Paris. So 13,000 originals, some 2,000 surviving. Is this therefore a very rare book? Well, this particular copy is unusual and very special because of the page we have here, which includes a note of the name of the scribe who contributed to it. From the 2,000 or so surviving copies, only 12 include the name of their scribe. The rest, beautifully written as they are anonymous for us. Of course, at the time when they were made, purchasers, early owners would have known where they came from, possibly even the identity of the scribe responsible. But as the centuries have gone by, that information is lost, but not here. Because at the end of the actual scriptural text, before we get on to the index of Hebrew names, so at the end of the Apocalypse, St. John's Revelation, there's a note by the same scribe writing every other line, and this is what it says. Anno Domini, millesimo duecentesimo quadraginta in the year of the Lord, 1244, perfecta est Biblia ista. This Bible was perfected or completed. Guilielmus dictus miles, Parisiensis, William, surnamed Knight, a Parisian, consumavit eam, brought it to completion. Sit ipse particeps, may he be a sharer, omnium bonorum, quae in ea comprehenduntur, of all the good things that are held within this book. So it provides us some precise information. The name of the scribe of this section of the book, William, surnamed Knight, that he was a Parisian, and the precise year in which the book was finished. He then says he wants to be a sharer in all the good things that are in it, so he wants benefits from it. He's almost certainly a secular lay professional, not a cleric. He hasn't described himself as clericus or monachus or frater noster, the typical sorts of phrases one would use to indicate a religious affiliation. John's revelation ends by cursing people who change the text, that if they add anything to it, plagues are to be added to them. And if they take anything away from it, i.e. they miss out words, then they are to be taken out of the book of life. The fact that William says he wants to share in all the good things that are in the book suggests that he was aware of what comes immediately before, that he thinks he's done a good job, and he therefore wants the benefits of doing it. What he hasn't said here is he's doing it for money, and he's almost certainly going to be paid. In fact, William, surnamed Knight, was not the only person involved in this book. Quite apart from whoever was making the parchment, he had a colleague who, in fact, wrote over half of it alongside him. Two scribes, two quite different hands, contributed to the writing of the book in 4 sections. So, hand 1, the first who began the book and then wrote the 3rd section, and whose name we don't know, he has a slightly smaller, more rounded script than that of William Knight. William Knight wrote the 2nd and the 4th sections, and he has a more elongated hand and lots of little details, certain abbreviation marks, as well as the aspect of the writing itself, enable us to distinguish his portion quite easily from that of the first hand. The first anonymous scribe, he wrote about 250 leaves, and William Knight wrote about 170. William Knight was the hand who finished off the Bible, and typically notes about production, if they were going to be supplied, were put at the end of the book, and thus it falls to his lot to complete the book and to say that he, William Knight, has done so. He doesn't mention his collaborator at all. That's not untypical for such records. The person who wrote them often didn't include everybody who was involved in the book, just himself. But there's good evidence that William Knight, even though he did the 2nd and 4th, rather than say the 1st and 4th sections, was the senior partner. And that's the corrections. Throughout the text, there are corrections. It's easy when copying for long hours to make errors. One's eye skips over a couple of words, and the hand that went back through the entire text, through the work of both scribes, carefully correcting it, is certainly that of William Knight. So what he says in his colophon is that he brought it to completion, which is an accurate account of the fact that he finished off the book, both in terms of writing Revelation and in terms of having gone through and corrected it. Scribe William was the corrector of the book, And we can see on this page a very clear example of him at work, because a large section of text was omitted in the original transcription, and so he's added it in the lower margin, outlining it in red. So it's very clear that that is a correction. It's in his hand, and he did most of the corrections throughout his stint and throughout the stint of his colleague, showing that he's the senior partner. Occasionally, if it was just a word or a small spelling error, he would scrape off the surface of the page and rewrite the letter in situ. If it was more than a word, he would accommodate that word at the bottom of the page. At the very beginning of the book, he has attempted to put corrections in the side margins, but obviously rapidly thought that that was more protrusive than always putting them in the bottom margin. So on this page, where a whole verse has been missed out, he's put a mark in the margin to indicate where the omission relates to, and then he's written 8 lines of missing verse in the lower margin. Whereas in the main body of the text, you read down column 1 and then down column 2, he's written the 8 missing lines across both columns, because that looks neater, but you actually read them as long continuous lines. And so what he's done is joined what he's written under column 1 with a squiggly red line to what he's written under column 2, so you know you read exceptionally in this case right the way along 4 whole lines. So the insertion is made in such a way as to minimise its visual impact, even if that includes a slight inconvenience for the reader. Now, as well as the 2 scribes, there were also illuminators. It's possible that one of the 2 scribes did the minor illumination, but they won't have done the major illumination. That was a skilled, separate cottage industry, and we know that interrelated families in Paris shared that sort of task. We don't know the names of many of them, but it's clear that the same hands appear from one Bible to the next. So here we've got the historiated initial introducing John's Revelation, John's Apocalypse, and there he is as author, seated, hunched over a writing desk where he's writing the Apocalypse itself, and behind him one can see 7 towers representing the 7 churches of Asia whom he addresses in the work. And at the top of the page it says Pokal, because on the facing page you have the Apocalypse. Here we have the initial to Genesis, the grandest, longest, largest historiated initial in the book, fitting its place as frontispiece to the sacred biblical text, and it's divided into segments, each with a minute, highly stylized image of God doing one of the acts of creation day by day. So, for instance, one can just see him forming up a little man from a mound of clay, or one can see him separating night from day. And then at the bottom of the initial, which has been slightly cropped, you have a grotesque, a little beast with wings and a head turning on itself, and this juxtaposition of illustrative subject matter and purely decoration is perfectly normal and fits comfortably within the medieval world view. Unfortunately, we don't know the identity of the original owner of this book. However, we have a lot of general contextual information about the sorts of people for whom one-volume Bibles were made in the 13th century. 2/3 of the cases where we know the identity of an early or original owner, they are mendicants, i.e. the friars, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And that makes logistical sense because, of course, if you're an itinerant preacher, you want to have a portable book to take around with you, so one-volume Bibles. well suited your activities. Most of the rest of the volumes whose early owners can be identified belong to university masters, people teaching at the University of Paris or Oxford or Bologna, the three earliest universities. The difference between the books owned by university masters as opposed to those belonging to mendicants was that the university masters, who weren't itinerant, had books that were slightly larger. They were going to stay in their universities, they were going to be used as personal reference copies, and therefore slightly bigger books, a wee bit easier to read, with larger margins in which one could make annotations and jottings, suited them better. Now, this example is of the slightly larger form, so we can be reasonably confident that it was made for a university master. And indeed, it does have a small number of jottings made in the 14th century, which are concordant with that. Some of them are minor corrections, others are allusions to other places in the Bible where the same texts appear, or are references to standard textbooks on the Bible used in university contexts. So we can hypothesize that this was commissioned by and owned by a university master at an early date. Its actual owners, their names are lost to us until the early 17th century. And we hear about it in the collection of William Boswell. And it was he who gave it to Wadham in the early 17th century. Now, William Boswell was one of the first scholars at the college, arriving a couple of years after it was founded, and he subsequently became a fellow, a post he held for the best part of 20 years. And within a year or two of getting his fellowship, he presented this and at least one other manuscript to the college. In the early 17th century, a book like this would not have been used as part of the reference collection of the library. It would already have been seen as a venerable antiquity, and he and other 17th century scholars who did the same were enriching their colleges with bibliographical treasures, not things that would support study, but items that would be themselves worthy objects to study, as is still the case today.